Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 78 with Cassandra, Corrado. So this is somebody that I've worked with for a very long time with the writing projects that I've done with Presence. So I've been working with them for now over 4 years, but Cassandra has now set out on her own to be a full-time independent sex educator for college students and adults. So it's really great to talk with her about her story and all kind of the life lessons that she's learned on her journey towards being that full-time independent kind of solopreneur, working in a really important space of doing kind of trauma-informed and really inclusive sex education for college students and adults. So she is out and about doing workshops and webinars and writing and doing a lot of cool stuff. So definitely check her out and the work that she's doing down in the show notes and connect with her and follow up. But she is great. This is a super fun episode. I'm so glad that we found time to do this, and I'm so excited for you to listen. So without further ado, this is episode number 78 with Cassandra Corrado. And we will start as we always do. If you just want to introduce yourself and give a brief overview of your professional journey and how you got to be where you are today.
I'm a sex educator who works with college students and other adults to basically help them unlearn shame and start to really step into the parts of their identity and the parts of their health, whether it's their physical health, their mental health, their sexual health, their emotional health, or something else entirely, that maybe they haven't been thinking about or they haven't been paying attention to. And I love working with adults. That's always been my kind of mission in the sex ed space. So many people do work with K-12, and that's vital. It's absolutely necessary, and we need more people doing it. But kids who don't get sex ed grow up into be adults who don't have sex education either. So for me, it was really important to not pretend like once you got to adulthood, obviously everything was figured out, because so isn't the case.
Yeah. Well, I think too, I'm sure perhaps more common right now that, a kid growing up right now may be getting a better, sex education than many of us did, as people who are maybe,
Right.
into adulthood and everything. So it's like, there's still like a high need for people who are, I guess theoretically people are like, oh, I'm sure they're fine. They know better or whatever, or just are encountering things they might not have thought of or, know how to cope with or deal with. So,
Yeah, absolutely. It differs state by state too, right? So like every state actually has different requirements for what students learn in sex education. So when you have students getting to college then, where you've got people from a lot of different states, you really can't assume that they're all on the same page, because a state that requires abstinence-only education is not the same as going to school in California, where you actually have like healthy youth education happening. And so when you get to adulthood, that's something completely different to keep in mind, is that everyone's educational background is really different just from a legislative perspective.
So I think we'll explore that a little bit more in a little bit, but I guess in terms of your origin story, I'm not sure, I guess, what might be anchored in terms of anything from your own college experience, the things that you did or learned, like courses you took or anything, but like, perhaps not, with the work that you're currently doing. Because on one hand, obviously it's the content of sex ed, but then also kind of being a solopreneur and, going out on your own recently, like anything from your own college experience that still resonates, like mentors, lessons learned, advice, that kind of stuff, anything that comes to mind, I guess, from your own college experience.
I wouldn't even be on this career path if I didn't have the college experience that I did, because at my liberal arts school, my first semester of college, I joined this organization called Voices for Planned Parenthood. And it, at the time, was a really new student organization. It was its first actual semester doing anything. And when I was there, most of the work that the organization was doing was sex education work. So we brought this speaker in. Her name was Megan Andiu, and she taught a workshop called Super Sex. And my mind was absolutely blown. I did not know that you could do sex education as a career path, just flat out to begin with. And I really didn't know that you could do sex ed where you're talking about pleasure, where you were talking about politics, you were talking about advocacy. I thought it was just like your typical health education type work. And I became just completely fixated on learning more about the industry. So I eventually went to go intern at her nonprofit, the Center for Sexual Pleasure and Health, And while I was there, I started to want to learn more about how we support survivors of sexual violence and how sex education and violence prevention and advocacy go hand in hand. And what I learned is that those two fields, like, they don't actually talk to each other very well, even though intuitively you're like, yes, sex education is a part of violence prevention. But you're coming from different educational frameworks. So I decided I was going to also learn about violence prevention and about victim advocacy. So I interned with my local rape crisis center, Spark. And while I was there, I was able to respond to hospital calls. So if a survivor came to the hospital and they wanted to get a forensic exam done, I would basically be there with them throughout the whole process, making sure they understood what was happening, making sure they knew that they could stop the exam at any time, and knew what their options were. And while I was doing that, I was still doing my sex education work, and I was just becoming more and more obsessed, really, with figuring out how all of these things were interacting with each other. And so many, many programming initiatives later, I started my campus's first 24/7 Healthy Relationships Education Resource Center. And so that was a drop-in space in the student union where you could get information for Spark, information for a campus victim advocate. You could read books about healthy relationships and positive sexuality. And that's like my pride and joy of my college experience. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without the internship opportunities that I had. I eventually, after graduation, went to go work at the CSPH full-time as the programs manager. So I traveled all across the country teaching sex ed workshops on college campuses and helping build out some of the local programs that the organization offers in Rhode Island. And the really cool thing is that actually, like, as of when we're recording this right now, next week I'm heading to Penn State and I'm going to be teaching that workshop that I saw Megan teach that kind of started me on this whole career path. So it's really come full circle in that way. And Megan was a fantastic mentor, and she's since retired. But without her guidance and without the organization, I wouldn't be where I am today. And it shows that, like, that one college program, that like one workshop you attend on your campus, it really can change a student's life, because it certainly changed mine.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, yeah, just like you're saying, just seeing that, like, that exists, that can be done, and having like that example is obviously just like so powerful. And yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I mean, yeah, you just, like you said, you just immerse yourself in this kind of stuff. So it seems just like an eventuality that you were able to kind of get to the point that you are now of, like really committing to this work full time, and yeah, just traveling and doing these workshops and doing webinars and all this really cool stuff. Really just putting out that knowledge. And I guess I'm curious, because I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding, like you were sort of always working, like, perhaps as sort of a side project independently, doing workshops and those sort of things while you kind of progressed through your career to like your current point. So I guess, like, talking through that a little bit of just sort of like how your work has evolved over time and how you kind of made that choice to really commit fully to doing this as sort of in a more, I guess, kind of independent capacity, or sort of, I guess, just walking through those sort of like decision points that kind of led you to where you are now.
Yeah, so back in like spring, summer of 2016, I decided that I needed to take a little bit of a break from the work I was doing. I was feeling really burnt out. And when you're doing victim advocacy work and you're teaching people about recovering from sexual violence and you're teaching people about consent and communication all the time, and you don't have like an adequate support system, it really builds up on you. So in 2016, I started to take a break. But in 2017, I was like, oh, I want to come back to this. I'm really missing this part of my life. And I felt ready and more supported to actually be doing this work. And I had students who had seen me at other workshops or who followed me on Instagram who wanted to bring me to their campus. So I actually started saying, like, you know what? Yeah, I am available for these things. And so back in 2017 is when I really started building up my independent work, but it was really light. I was teaching just a couple of workshops a semester. And I had some standing clients who, like, I knew that I would go to Pennsylvania almost every semester to go teach a workshop at Bryn Mawr because I have a really good relationship with the students there. But that was really what it was for a while. And then I had a partnership with an organization called O School. And with O School, I started doing live streaming workshops. And that's really when things started to shift a little bit, because I was live streaming once a week and teaching on really different types of things that I teach than when I'm on campus. Super niche workshops that were only like an hour long instead of an hour and a half to 2 hour long college workshop. And then I needed a break from that, because live streaming every single week when you're also working full time, and when you're traveling to teach and consulting on the side, which I was also doing social media consulting for sex ed nonprofits at the time. It was a lot. It was too much. And I'm definitely the person who I'll pick up too much before I'm willing to say it's too much. And then I have to figure out what I can let go of. And so it was kind of a weird transitional period, which led all the way up to October of 2019, when I gave my notice at my full-time job. I really knew I couldn't balance it anymore, and I was feeling every day like I wanted to be doing the sex ed work full-time. I had started to pick up writing things, and I was having to turn down opportunities because I couldn't do them if I was also working full time and still working in higher ed. I was working in the ed tech space. I was at Presence, but there's a difference between like working in the higher ed field and working in the niche part of the higher ed field that you want to be working in. And for me, I knew I wanted to continue working in higher ed, and I loved doing what I was doing, but I wanted to be doing that sex education work full time. So I, after like months really of figuring out if I could afford to do it and if I had enough money saved up, I decided that it's what I needed to do. And right after I did that, I had to get emergency surgery. I got my appendix out. So like, I was so happy that I still like had my health insurance from my old job, because I had a coverage gap for 2 months. And so it really just showed me like, I'm glad that I did this the way I did. I'm glad that I took the time to prepare myself for it instead of just saying, you know what, I'm going to take the leap and we'll figure it out as we go. I really intentionally planned out like when I was going to give my notice, how much money I needed to have saved up in the event of something like having to get your appendix out of nowhere. And that was my last day at Presence was October 4th, 2019. And I haven't looked back. I've been really lucky in that I have so many freelance writing things that have come my way. So I get to do sex ed through writing for these awesome publications and organizations that want to amp up their sex education work. But I've also started doing live stream workshops at least every month, if not every week, just depends on the month. And I'm still teaching on college campuses. So the work looks really different now than it did when I was trying to balance like 14 different plates. But yeah, I did make that change from doing it on the side to doing it full-time freelance, which is technically what I do now.
Well, yeah, I think it is kind of recurrent to the people I know that have made a similar kind of transition. Is like you have that sort of epiphany or that kind of crossroad, like the realization of, okay, like this side project is now like, getting in the way of like full-time job or like it's kind of just like there's a clashing there's a friction of like, my level of engagement in my job, I'm kind of like, I'm not feeling it as much anymore because I'm super excited about this side project, but I have to say no to certain things because I do still have this commitment over here. And like, so, I was curious, I guess, kind of how that came about. But I think, it's just been kind of building momentum over time and just really like, it always seems like it was kind of the end game, sort of being pulled towards this work more fully. So
wasn't a decision without fraud, like I went to therapy for like 4 months just to talk about this decision and like how I was going to do it and what that would look like. And because I supervised people, like that was it. It wasn't like I was just one person and the company would be replacing my work. Like I supervised this team of people who I grew myself. None of them had been at the company before I started. So I'd always been their manager. And I felt really scared about leaving them, and I felt really scared about leaving them in the middle of some pretty big projects. We had just started Will There Be Food when I made the decision to leave.
Right.
And so for me, it was very much of like balancing the I really love and want to keep supporting my team, but I know I'm not giving them my 100%. I'm not giving them the energy that they deserve. And when I was able to make that reconciliation of like, I'm not giving them the best part of me and they deserve to have that in a supervisor, that made the decision a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I appreciate you mentioning just like therapy because yeah, just like figuring out how to sort of like talk yourself through that because I'm sure like there's a lot of different ways and just like giving that a lot of like, sort of quality time and sort of discourse and therapy is like interesting. So I could imagine, I would need something similar as well, just because like, yeah, like you feeling like, oh, I'm like abandoning my team, I'm doing whatever. And like, because I think for me, it's sometimes like always like, it's that idea of like, because a friend of mine always says it about like New York City, where there's like always somebody doing like better than you or worse than you. So it's kind of just being, hey, just be satisfied with where you're at, like you're good or whatever. Like, and it kind of like always makes me think too of just like, you're never as like important or unimportant as you think you are, where it's just like, hey, like don't like put all this on your shoulders. Like if I leave, like the world will be over, everyone will be suffering, whatever.
Right.
Like, relax. You're not like that big of a deal, but also like give, credence to like what you want. Like that's also important because, sort of subconscious to that is like, like putting others' needs like so far and above your own. So it's like, well, I want to care for them or whatever. I don't know. There's just so much to that. And it's just a very interesting, sort of exercise, I guess, that you went through of just having to really like examine and build that capacity to be like, you know what, it's going to be fine. And, you put in a lot of good time and a lot of good work and, built a good team that is able to, carry things on after you leave and everything. So I guess just really quick, I mean, obviously, you just mentioned obviously how much you have immersed yourself in this work and done it for such a long time and some of those kind of milestones and kind of victories that you really have appreciated that you've accomplished so far. Like just what else in terms of just like what keeps you like engaged in this work, keeps you excited? Any like kind of like anecdotes of those sort of like milestones or things like, just like what do you enjoy most about your current work? So I get, there's obviously a lot of complexity, like you were saying, a lot of different like legislations. There's always, I think, some kind of cultural sort of friction with this kind of topic. It's, sensitive for a lot of people. So, like what keeps you engaged in this work that I'm sure could be, emotionally draining sometimes or just difficult to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like higher ed, just in general, it's the students. So I have the pleasure of working with people who are like generally from 18 to 32, we'll say 85% of my students fall into that range. But then I end up having some students who are older and working with them, regardless of what that age group is, but seeing people really start to think about the way that they interact with other people and start to unpack some of their own values is super rewarding to me. So, for example, I was in Philly about a year ago and I taught a workshop called Sex in Translation. It's one of my signature workshops. And I taught it at a sex shop in Philly called Kink Shop. And it was a small group of people. It was a group of adults. Everybody was at least in their 40s. And in that conversation, people were there with their partners, talking about their relationships, talking about the ways that they are afraid to talk about sex or that they feel ashamed to talk about sex or the way that their reactions actually prevent them from having honest conversations about sex. And then just seeing people, like, there is this quiet moment that happens. And you can see when people start to look inside of themselves and say, like, I could do this one thing that would change my interaction with my partner. It would change how I perceive us arguing. It would change how I perceive my own fear and anxiety about talking about sex. And so when I see 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds having that moment, it is so rewarding because it's like there is never a point when it's too late to learn about sex. And then, of course, like I get to see that happen with, 18 to 32-year-olds all the time. And that's such a transformative period in people's lives. And for me, like I got this message from a student last week that somebody had already told me they had been like really excited after an online workshop that they attended. But the student themselves hadn't said anything to me for a bit, but last week messaged me and said, I really appreciate how intentional and inclusive you are in your workshops because I've never had education that didn't assume that my partner was cis and a different gender than me. And I didn't have sex education that allowed me to talk about my trauma and like bring that into the room. And so that shows me that like, yeah, it can be really draining sometimes. And like this month, so, we're talking about this in February 2020 when we're recording. And I made the brilliant decision of doing one online live streamed workshop every week for February. And that it's a lot. And I still have a lot of writing deadlines. So like this week, I had 7 writing deadlines. And I also had to prep for a workshop and get out the resources from the last workshop. And so on weeks like this week, when I'm really drained, like I have those messages from students that I just turn back to and I can reflect on. And I'm like, right, there's a reason I'm doing this. And like, I might feel really tired and like I need a nap today. But on Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m., when I'm done with that workshop, I'm going to feel really good. And that's how I've kept myself energized. And it's how I've always kept myself energized. I get really, really nervous before I go teach. And like the second I get on a stage and I'm interacting with students and when I get to talk with them afterwards, I don't have anything that I do in my life that is more energy and purpose restoring than that little bit of time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I just like too how you like, because like on one hand, or I guess it kind of just made me think about it, kind of mention it more so like, it's never too late kind of thing, but also just like it can be powerful knowing that when you're reaching someone, when they're like 18 and maybe they're like, in their first year's relationship or about to get into one, like, it's like, great, you're going to have such a better precedent than and everybody should have that really good, like precedent and sort of knowledge and everything that you're, sort of instilling into them. And then for anybody else, yeah, like also just like, hey, it's never too late either. So like everybody, hey, like if you, whatever you feel like you need to learn more about or kind of any topic you feel like you need to engage in, just like, really welcoming, all people and, then conveying the information like you're saying in a really inclusive way. Cause I think, I'm sure some people, because it's just like, man, this is just like, something that I really want to, work on or learn more about, but then they make the effort to show up somewhere and then it feels sort of less than, in terms of just the inclusivity of things. So that is just so great. I mean, just like you doing it in general and then doing it in such a way that people feel like it's such a, breath of fresh air. Just like, oh my gosh, I've never like, and I guess too, if you're saying like some people are, it's like, I've never had any educational experience that's felt like so inclusive kind of thing, where it's just like, yeah, even if you're taking like an intro biology class or something, it's like, it should just feel like, I don't know, everybody's respected and then like those sort of things. Cause like, it's even as simple as just like putting things into a syllabus or like, mentioning different resources, like when you have like your, your first course or something. So, it's really, really cool stuff. Yeah. I'm so glad that I guess like, cause also too, that like, that it's resonating with people and then like, that they like tell you, like, it's like so many people, like they don't express that gratitude, like they feel it, but they don't let people know. Just like, generally I think in our lives, we can overlook that. So I'm so glad that like you've also gotten that positive feedback as well.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely makes it way easier to keep doing any type of work when you're getting that positive feedback. And when I teach, like, I take really seriously that, there is a time and a place for a lecture, and sex ed is never the time nor the place. And so if you're doing sex education, like you need to keep people engaged. You need to be giving them different types of media to play with and to think about and to choose to engage with or choose to not engage with. And really, like, I know that every time I teach, because my background is in victim advocacy, I tell people this is my background. And so every workshop I teach, whether it's a dirty talk workshop or it's like a oral sex workshop, or it's a generic kind of like sex ed, sex positivity workshop, we're going to talk about trauma at least briefly, because I'm coming from the mindset that everybody is going to experience some type of trauma at some point in their lives. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual or interpersonal trauma. It could be a car accident. It could be somebody dealing with an eating disorder or a mental health situation that was traumatic to them. When you like open up that space to say like, this is going to be part of this conversation, you're basically just preparing people. And I do that with letting them know we're talking about trauma. I do that with how we're going to be talking about sexuality and how we're going to be talking about gender. And I basically just like say, for the next 2 hours, this is the language I'm using. You don't have to be on the same page with me for this language. I don't expect you to be fluent in this, but know that like, this is where I am and this is where I'm coming from. And then I make sure to reaffirm that all throughout. And for me, I feel like that's been the really big difference. And the great thing is like when I get to teach workshops like that to med students or to psychology graduate students, right? Where I know that these are all people who are future professionals and who could be leading workshops like this themselves one day for their colleagues. Because that is really inclusivity, like just isn't this one thing. It's not a checkbox, and it's not something that you can just easily change. And it requires people to do a lot of intentional reflection about their internal biases and the things that they're not thinking about. And so it's nice to be able to shift people's perspectives about that, even just a little bit when it comes to sex and sexuality. And it's not just about gender and sexual orientation, right? Like it's about trauma, it's about ability, it's about race, it's about socioeconomic status. Like every aspect of our identities that we would consider to be like critical areas of focus in student affairs, those are all critical things to look at when you're doing sex education as well, because all of those things impact on our sexuality and how we engage in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's yes, just to affirm all of that. Yeah, it's such good stuff, and I think hopefully broaden some people's awareness of what blind spots they might have, because it really is a value that everybody should have, and not put on just sort of like one person to be sort of the lone advocate, because like you said, I mean, just the idea of you're obviously only one person that can only do so much, but if you're doing these things to empower other people who might be doing workshops on their own teams and everything like that, like making sure that they're seeing a good inclusive example of how they should be doing that and given just some guidance there. But well, I guess with any of this stuff, like if it's any stuff that helps kind of inform the work you do, or any sort of like tools or other maybe just like fun stuff, like what are you geeking out about that's really like keeping you inspired, or just like helping you relax or have fun, or anything that comes to mind? Because I'm curious, anything that you might want to kind of give a tip of the hat to.
So like things that to me are just fun are things like gardening. Like anytime that I need to just kind of take a break from what I'm doing, whether it's writing or working on a lesson plan, I'll just walk outside and I'll go sit in my garden for a little bit, or I'll go trim back like the plants, and just having that mental reset for me is really helpful. And then when I think about like my actual sex ed work, stuff that keeps me inspired, I'm really fascinated by communication. And one of my big educational focus areas is communication and just how people understand each other. And so I listen to a lot of podcasts that are like two people podcasts. And I love listening to all of the times they misinterpret each other and then go like, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this thing. And just kind of studying like how people cope with that, and how then the other person responds, and how you move through that, especially in podcasts where they don't edit out or cut down those moments as much. And so for me, like that's really fun. Like it's almost just like this light little exercise for me, and like, yeah, these are all the ways that like humans can misunderstand each other or really understand each other. Which is it's kind of a weird thing to say that like that's something that gives me professional energy or revitalizes me, but it does, because communication is at the center of everything that we do, and I think it's something that's always worth trying to improve in some way, or at least learning to understand everybody's communication differences a little bit better.
Yeah. Yep. And I mean, I definitely think it's interesting, because I think most people would like edit out those things, which I've realized like certain shows like have acknowledged that they edit out, because like people are like, man, like your conversations are so smooth, and like they're always like right in line with each other. Like, well, yeah, I mean, we edit out a lot because we have to kind of like double back and be like, actually no, I meant the opposite of that.
Yep.
But yeah, if they keep it in, then it's like interesting, because I mean, having a little bit like of patience and kind of giving some grace to people, where it's like it's not ill intent, I'm sure, more often than not that people like misunderstand each other. So kind of just working on making sure that there's that, mutual understanding is obviously always a good thing. Yeah. Well, I guess I'm curious then for like gardening as sort of like a, unique thing. Like, is that something that you've always been into, or like recently got into, and like, I don't know how much you kind of like geek out about that, or if that's just been like your own journey, or if you like, obviously there's like, I'm sure there's like all these YouTube channels or something about gardening or something. I don't know like how much you like go deep on it, or if it's just sort of a leisurely thing.
Yeah, it's kind of a leisurely thing, but it started when I was in elementary school. I was president of the environmental club in fifth grade, which basically meant like I worked in my school's butterfly garden every Saturday. And then for a while I was afraid of dirt, just like fully afraid of it. I didn't want to touch it. It freaked me out. I didn't like how it felt. And so maybe 4 years ago, I started gardening again, and it was just this really soothing practice for me. But I think honestly, the nerdiest part about it is that I have an Airtable, which you're familiar with from pitch meetings at Presence, but it's basically like a spreadsheet tool that you can turn into a Kanban board if you want, or a calendar. And I track all of my plants' progress in that Airtable. So like from the day that I plant their seeds to how long it's supposed to take them to actually germinate, to just how they're doing once they're fully grown, and if they were successful or not successful. I track all of them there because, like, why not have data on the fact that my cucumbers all died last summer? And so I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at gardening, but because I live in South Florida, the nice thing is that it's kind of gardening season all year round. I can grow tomatoes in December because it's like 85 degrees here still. And so that gives me a lot more time to play with it. Whereas people who live, in Indiana, you've got a little bit more of a restriction there. Like your playtime's kind of limited. And so for me, it's nice because I get that all year round, and I get to just experiment with it. And I would probably really benefit from reading a book on gardening so that I would stop killing my cucumbers. But I'll get it one day. I'll go to the library and get a book about South Florida gardening, because it's a whole new territory. Like, plants are really not meant to grow here, but they manage it all year round. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because like you're like undertaking it as if you're like one of the first humans just trying to figure out like how does this all work? I don't understand.
I am I'm totally ignoring that there are plenty of YouTube channels and podcasts and books about this, and I'm just like, all right, gonna plant these seeds and like see what happens.
Yeah, but also doing it as sort of like this like Enlightenment era like scientist, where like I'm tracking it all. I don't know, I'm trying to figure it out. Like I'm doing like that like sort of nerdy capacity or like sort of aspect to it is what I'm just like, I guess, fascinating, because I'm just like, yeah, I mean, you could pull together quarterly reports and make them in the charts and things, and like you just like like sit your partner down and just be like, okay, I have a presentation prepared. I want to let you know how all the plants are doing over time and projected growth rates. But
yeah, you tease, but like we did have a conversation like that once. My partner and I, like when I first set this up, I was like, all right, so I need to show you how the plant Airtable works, and this is how we're going to track everything, and it's gotten to the point where like I keep our pantry supplies, like, what spices we have, how much flour we have. Like I track all of that in Airtable. So I'm kind of running our whole household through it and showing how much we go through things. And
yeah, I mean, it's a great project management tool.
It really is. This is not sponsored by Airtable, but like, let us know if you want to talk. But yeah, I feel really excited about it. And I think for me, like I'm a perfectionist, so it's really freeing for me to just be like, I'm going to plant these seeds and see what happens. And then when all of my cucumbers die, I'm like, that didn't go great. That sucks. And I just try again. And like, I could read a book and try to do it perfectly, but I would be so much more frustrated than when my cucumbers died, because they would still die, I'm pretty sure. Right. So I like
I did what the book told me. Like, yeah.
Right. It's just, I didn't move them far enough out of the sun. And then the Florida sun literally just burned through their leaves in one day is what happened last year. But I like letting go of that perfectionism for a little bit with gardening and just saying like, I'm going to experiment with this. And then maybe after my second round or my third round of trying to do something, then I'll go back and read a book and see what I can do better, like what I can improve on, what I'm maybe missing. And instead of like trying to get it all perfect and have this like perfect, amazing garden right off the bat, like I'm content with the fact that my rosemary has survived 4 years, but I've gone through like 8 basil plants in the same amount of time.
Well, it's an interesting way to look at it too. Yeah, like that. It's kind of a good exercise of sort of letting go of control and just sort of like following your intuition or instincts, or just sort of, yeah, like kind of trial and error. Um, but well, I guess as you mentioned, you were not reading or watching any gardening content or
No.
anything. But anything else, I guess, as we're winding down, just stuff that you might want to really quick, just give recommendations to. Again, stuff for fun or stuff more professionally related that you are reading, watching, and or listening to that we can include in the show notes.
Yeah, so I just recently started listening to the New York Times Modern Love podcast. So I've always read the Modern Love column when it comes out, but they have a podcast where they like hire actors to read some of the letters, and that's been a really beautiful experience because then they do a talk back with the authors. I also listen to My Favorite Murder just in the background while I'm working. I've decided that Karen and Georgia are my new friends. They have no idea that I exist, but we're friends and it's fine. And they're really fun because they do edit out some parts of their conversation, but like I would say the first 30 minutes of their podcast is just like two friends catching up with each other before they start going into the storytelling. And they've done some like really interesting stuff around victim awareness and just talking about victim stories. And so I'm definitely like, I can't listen to a lot of true crime stuff. Like I can't listen to Murder Squad or anything that's just like talking about the facts of things, but I do love hearing people's stories that we don't get to hear enough. So that's what I've really been listening to. I've listened to an absurd amount of it in the past month because I just leave it on in the background while I work. And half the time I have to re-listen to the episode because I've totally missed everything. But those are two of the things that I'm listening to right now. And I'm reading a lot. Like I live down the street from a library, so I just walk up to the library and I will just walk around and like grab books, whatever books I feel like. And so I try to read a book a week. And I just finished Normal People by Sally Rooney, which was fascinating. I literally finished it this morning. So now I'm going to go pick up my new book, which is Radium Girls, and that's a historical book, and that actually just talks about the history, like this really kind of sickening U.S. industrial history thing that happened. So I'm all over the place when it comes to types of media that I consume, like with part tiny house shows, part murder podcast, and then part just like any book that I come across. So that's what I'm doing right now, / always.
Very cool. Well, then we will end the episode here. Always one of my favorite questions to see how folks take it. But what is something or are some things that you are looking forward to in your job, life, and or the world? So anything that comes to mind, you want to try to hit on all of those, or just any one thing. But yeah, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm in the middle of this 4 workshops, like a workshop every weekend in February. So I have workshop number 2 this weekend, and I'm really excited for that. And then on Thursday, I'm actually heading to a school that I've never taught at before, Penn State, and I'm going to their main campus. So I'm really excited for that. It's supposed to snow when I'm there. So those are my like things I'm excited for professionally this month. But also we just passed this legislation here in Florida, or it just made it past the Senate, I should say. It's called Senate Bill 404. And it's an abortion-related bill, and it's being called the Forced Parental Consent Bill. And it basically requires minors to have to get a notarized letter from their parents or guardians saying it's okay for them to get an abortion. So it's pretty restrictive legislation. And it just passed the Senate yesterday, and it's going to the House for a vote soon. And then our governor has pretty much guaranteed that he's going to sign it into law. So for me, a lot of my friends are activists, and I don't know that I necessarily consider myself an activist, but I do try to educate people just on the stuff that's happening around them. So given that primaries are coming up pretty soon here in Florida, and that we do have all of these major laws that are being pushed through, I'm really excited to see the things that activists do and to see people hopefully get really connected with this political cycle, because our politics affects our health at just such a granular level that I think we should all really care about it. And there's stuff happening in every single state right now that we should care about. So not to like make a political plug to call your senators about this legislation, but just like be in tune with what's happening, because I guarantee you, like, there are so many Floridians who didn't even know that this passed the Senate yesterday and that it will eventually be signed into law. But we should all be knowing about stuff like that. And so I'm excited for people to start to get energized as the election gets closer and closer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, honestly, like it's something that I've been at least somewhat reassured about is like this current moment politically, like seeing a lot more people I feel like engaged in this kind of stuff. I'm like somewhat reassured that that's happening, where it's just like, I wish we weren't here to begin with, but you know what, if this is inspiring more people to, I don't know, be engaged in the political process, then that's a good thing. And yeah, just like skim the newspaper so you know what's going on in your local area, and also just make sure that you engage with what's going on and make sure that your community represents your values and that you're at least being heard. And I saw some President's folks that were down there protesting really that law. And it seemed at least like it was making at least a somewhat immediate impact. But it's always good advice. Yeah, like know what's going on, and call your representatives and all that good stuff when you need to let them know how you feel.
Yeah, and like I think people get overwhelmed so easily, and I tell them like just make a separate email address. Like I make like your normal email address, and then change it a little bit to be like activism in part of it. And then sign up just for a bunch of local organizations that you're curious to learn more about the work that they're doing and the types of things that they support and oppose, and have all of the email go there. And then just set a limit for yourself. Like, I'm going to check this once a week, or I'm going to check this twice a week. And just that way you can stay in tuned in this really filtered way of like, okay, I trust these organizations to tell me what I need to know about, and not have to rely on filtering everything else out that you might be sifting through, because it's really easy to get burnt out when you're trying to stay in tune with everything. And so like set the system up for yourself so that you can be informed without letting your like burnout monster take over your life.
Yeah. It's either like you, like kind of overwhelm yourself with like the fire hose of like things you're supposed to care about, or it like, you kind of are following things, but it's in the mix of everything else. So it kind of gets lost in the noise, or, those kind of things. So it's definitely good advice. And, you can give time, you could give money, you can give just sort of like signal boosting, or sort of like volunteer or something, a lot of ways to engage too. So
absolutely.
Definitely a very good, optimistic kind of rallying cry there for folks at the end of the episode here. But thank you so much for your time and all that you shared. And we'll have ways to have folks who are listening connect with you down in the show notes. But thank you again so much. And just have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Thanks so much for having me.
This podcast is part of the Connect EDU podcast network, bringing together diverse voices in the higher ed community. Check us out on Twitter at ConnectEDUPod or at connectedu.network. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast.